When I saw him pick up my phone and start scrolling, my heart skipped, not from fear of being caught, but from the dread of what he might find. The messages. The ones I had forgotten to delete. I tried to snatch the phone back, but he was quick, pulling it just out of reach and continuing to read. I watched his face change as he read line after line, feeling my world crumble in seconds. Yes, now he would know the truth. But not the whole truth. His hands trembled as he flicked through, and I knew, any moment he'd reach the one message that would shatter everything. The one that would explain it all and mark the end. Or maybe twist the story even more. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in his hands, lighting up with a new notification. I saw his face go pale as he read the sender's name. He froze. Didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a nervous habit I hadn't lost. My nerves tangled with the horror of what I'd done. His breath quickened. I heard it from 2 meters away, across the room. That was the one thing I feared most. Because 3 months ago, I made a mistake, the kind of mistake that changes everything forever. And now, I didn't know what to do. But let me tell you how it really happened. Before I share the secret I tried so hard to hide for so long, write in the comments where you're watching from, and answer this. Have you ever kept a secret so tightly that it finally broke free, no matter how hard you tried? I remember that day so clearly, though part of me wishes I could erase it completely. The weight of invisibility was crushing me. It wasn't that I was unhappy with my marriage, it wasn't that simple. Our life had settled into a predictable rhythm, the kind where passion quietly slips away and you don't notice until the silence becomes deafening. I felt like a ghost in my own home, a woman whose presence was barely acknowledged. My husband's eyes no longer found mine with warmth, his touch was rare and mechanical. The subtle distance had grown into a chasm, and I was left grasping for something I couldn't quite name. I wasn't the kind to complain. I kept my worries to myself, told myself that after so many years, it was normal for love to change shape. But the nights alone, the cold bed beside me, the quiet dinners where words hung unspoken, it all chipped away at my confidence. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. She was still there, beneath the surface, but fading. I needed a sign, something to remind me that I mattered, that I was still capable of feeling alive. It was during one of those bleak evenings that my closest friend called. She had always been outspoken, the kind of woman who didn't shy away from hard truths. Her voice was lively, teasing, and I welcomed the distraction. As we talked, she surprised me with a suggestion that felt both shocking and strangely inviting. "Maybe it's time you borrowed my husband for a while," she said with a smirk. The words hung in the air between us, daring me to react. At first, I laughed it off, thinking it was a joke born out of her mischievous nature. But as she explained, I realized she meant it seriously. She spoke about how their marriage was complicated, how she wanted to help me find back the spark I'd lost. She painted a picture of a controlled, carefully arranged encounter, not a betrayal, but a way to reclaim myself. The idea was outrageous, unsettling, yet it sparked a flicker of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. I found myself torn. On one hand, the very thought challenged everything I believed about loyalty and love. On the other, it promised a chance to feel seen again, to break free from the suffocating silence. The conversation ended with an invitation to meet, to discuss it face to face. I agreed, not fully understanding what I was stepping into, but desperate enough to listen. When we met, the atmosphere was charged. My friend was calm, confident, almost in control of the moment in a way that made me both nervous and curious. She outlined her plan with precision, assuring me she would guide every step, watching over me as if to shield from harm. Her eyes held a strange intensity, one I couldn't decipher then. The more she spoke, the more I felt myself slipping into a world where rules blurred, and my own desires surfaced in the most unexpected ways. The man I was to meet was not just anyone. He was her husband, handsome, assured, and carrying the weight of secrets behind his smile. When I finally saw him, my heart raced with a mixture of fear and anticipation. He greeted me with a nod, his gaze steady but unreadable. I realized then that this was no simple game. There were layers beneath the surface, and I was already caught in their depths. As the evening unfolded, I wrestled with a tumult of emotions. Doubt clashed with longing, guilt battled with the urgent need to feel alive again. I tried to convince myself this was a temporary detour, a necessary step to reclaim what I had lost. But deep down, I knew that once I crossed this line, nothing would be the same. The silence in my marriage had been broken, but at what cost? Later that night, lying awake in my dark bedroom, I replayed every moment. The subtle glances, the weight of unspoken words, the touch of a stranger who was supposed to be off limits. I felt like a stranger myself, caught between who I was and who I was becoming. The promise of renewal was tangled with fear, a fear that this path might lead to destruction, or worse, to truths I wasn't ready to face. In the end, I understood that my story was just beginning, and the consequences of my choice would ripple through every part of my life. But for the first time in months, I felt something stir inside, a fragile spark of hope, trembling yet undeniable. The day I met him in that quiet cafe, the air between us was thick with tension I couldn't quite place. She had arranged everything. My friend, the architect of this strange plan, was calm and composed, guiding me through every step with a mixture of reassurance and subtle control. The moment I saw him, the man she called her husband, a wave of conflicting emotions crashed over me. He was nothing like I expected. His presence was steady, his eyes measured, but beneath it all, there was something guarded, almost hesitant. We sat at a corner table, the hum of the city outside barely reaching us. My friend explained once again the boundaries and the reasons behind this arrangement. Her words were precise, her tone firm. I could tell she was watching my every reaction, reading my unease and trying to push me gently forward. The plan was simple on the surface but complicated in its implications, a carefully choreographed dance where I was both participant and observer. As the conversation flowed, I noticed the subtle ways he looked at me. Not with lust or judgment, but with a kind of curious reserve. His glances lingered just long enough to unsettle me, yet never crossed the line. The strange mix of attraction and caution stirred something in me, a faint echo of the passion I thought I'd lost forever. I felt my pulse quicken, my breath catching in ways that surprised me. Then it happened, an unexpected moment where our eyes met and held, and the air shifted. We kissed. We kissed. There were no grand declarations or dramatic gestures, just that brief, charged meeting of lips that carried the weight of years of longing and regret. It was a silent acknowledgement of desire and fear intertwined. In that instant, I felt both alive and deeply vulnerable. The kiss passed quickly, but its impact lingered. My mind raced, questioning everything. Was this a step toward rediscovery or the beginning of a dangerous descent? I felt torn between the comforting routine I had known and the unpredictable path unfolding before me. The boundaries blurred, and I realized that this encounter was more than a simple favor, it was a turning point. Throughout the evening, the conversation shifted from logistics to unspoken emotions. I caught glimpses of his struggles too, the fatigue behind his smile, the weight of expectations. It became clear that none of us were as in control as we pretended. My friend's composed demeanor hinted at secrets I wasn't ready to uncover, yet I sensed her involvement was deeper than friendship. As I left that cafe, the city lights blurred into streaks of uncertainty. I felt the stirrings of something I hadn't allowed myself in years, a tentative hope mixed with apprehension. The kiss, brief as it was, had unlocked a door I thought forever closed. But stepping through meant facing the unknown, with all its risks and consequences. In the days that followed, my routine shifted subtly but irreversibly. Every glance from my husband felt heavier, every silence more profound. I found myself replaying the moment over and over, questioning my desires and the loyalty that bound me. The thin line between right and wrong became increasingly blurred, and I was left to navigate the murky waters of my own heart. Meanwhile, my friend maintained a careful distance, yet her presence was a constant reminder of the game we had begun. I caught her watching me sometimes, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. Was it concern, satisfaction, or something else? I couldn't tell. Her motives remained wrapped in mystery, and that uncertainty gnawed at me. One evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, I realized that I was no longer the woman I had been before that kiss. Something fundamental had shifted, an awakening of feelings long suppressed. The safe boundaries of my life had been breached, and now I was faced with the daunting task of confronting what lay beyond. The journey ahead was unclear, fraught with emotional pitfalls and unexpected turns. But beneath the fear was a spark, fragile yet persistent, that urged me to seek what I had lost, not just passion, but a sense of self. And so, with trembling resolve, I prepared to follow this uncertain path, knowing that the choices I made would change everything. The message from my husband came late in the afternoon, a brief text that said he would be tied up at work longer than expected. It was a small thing, routine even, but to me, it felt like a door opening to the unknown. My friend immediately seized on the opportunity, inviting me to spend the evening at her countryside home. Her voice was light, but beneath it, I detected the undercurrent of control that had marked our interactions since the beginning of this strange arrangement. The drive out of the city was a study in contrasts, the relentless pace of urban life fading into the quiet, rolling fields that surrounded her house. I watched the landscape blur past, a restless energy building inside me. The countryside held a different kind of stillness, one that forced me to confront the feelings I'd been avoiding. My friend's house stood alone, a place both welcoming and enigmatic, much like the woman herself. As I crossed the threshold, I felt the weight of the evening settling around me. The rooms were warm, filled with soft light and the faint scent of something floral, unfamiliar yet inviting. My friend greeted me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, a reminder that beneath her calm exterior was a mind always several steps ahead. She led me inside, where her husband waited, his expression unreadable but his posture relaxed, as if accustomed to this ritual. The hours that followed were marked by an intricate dance of glances, half-spoken words, and subtle movements. My friend remained close, orchestrating the scene with quiet precision, her presence both comforting and unsettling. I noticed the way her eyes flicked between us, analyzing, judging, perhaps even savoring the unfolding moment. We moved to the garden, a secluded space where shadows stretched long under the fading sun. The quiet was broken only by the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds settling in for the night. It was in this space, away from the watchful eyes of the world, that I began to sense the complexity of what was happening. The man I had met weeks before was more than just a partner in this strange game. He revealed moments of tenderness that caught me off guard. I saw in him a man carrying burdens of his own, restraints placed by loyalty, past regrets, and a desire to maintain control in a situation that felt as precarious as mine. Our conversations were sparse but meaningful, a shared understanding that neither of us fully owned the path we were on. There was no pretense of romance, only a fragile connection forged through mutual recognition of loneliness and the need to feel alive. My friend's watchful gaze remained a constant, a silent reminder of the stakes. I wondered about her true intentions, questioning whether this was an act of generosity or something darker. Her control was a thread that bound us, yet also threatened to unravel the fragile trust between us. As night deepened, the garden became a cocoon where the lines between friendship, desire, and betrayal blurred. I found myself drawn to the man's quiet strength, the way his eyes held both distance and invitation. It was a dangerous allure, one that made me question the boundaries I had set for myself. Inside the house, the atmosphere shifted with the closing of doors and the dimming of lights. shadows lengthened, and the weight of unspoken truths settled heavily. I caught my reflection in a windowpane, a woman caught between worlds, yearning for something intangible yet vital. The hours slipped by in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The conversations we had, though brief, revealed layers of complexity about love, loss, and the consequences of choices made in desperation. I realized that this evening was more than a meeting, it was a turning point, a test of my own capacity to confront the loneliness that had taken root. As I lay awake that night in the guest room, the quiet enveloped me like a shroud. I wrestled with the emotions stirred by the day, the excitement tinged with guilt, the fear mingled with hope. I understood that this was only the beginning of a journey that would force me to face parts of myself I had long buried. The countryside, so peaceful and distant from my usual life, had become the backdrop for a transformation I couldn't yet fully grasp. The next steps were unclear, fraught with uncertainty and the possibility of profound change. Yet, amid the confusion, a small spark of courage flickered within me, the courage to embrace the unknown and seek a path back to myself. The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a pale glow on the quiet room where I awoke. The world outside seemed unchanged, yet inside me, the turbulence of the previous days swirled relentlessly. I felt a strange mix of anticipation and apprehension as I prepared to face whatever the day might bring. The countryside still held its calm, but beneath that peaceful surface, I sensed the shifting currents of something far more complex. As I stepped into the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint aroma of herbs from the garden. My friend was already there, her movements deliberate, controlled. She greeted me with a nod that conveyed both solidarity and calculation. The man was nowhere in sight, leaving a tension hanging between us that was thick and uneasy. We sat down at the rustic wooden table, the silence stretching longer than comfort allowed. Finally, she broke it with a question that seemed simple but carried hidden weight. "How do you feel?" Her eyes searched mine, looking for answers I wasn't sure I could give. I hesitated, grappling with a mixture of guilt and relief, confusion and desire. I admitted to her the conflict within, the loneliness that had driven me here, the unexpected stirrings of emotion that surprised and unsettled me. She listened, her face unreadable, before offering a small, knowing smile. It was clear that her intentions were layered, what she said and what she felt were not always the same. Later, we wandered outside into the garden, the air crisp and filled with the sounds of morning life. As we walked among the blooming flowers, she shared stories of her own struggles, her doubts, regrets, and the fractures in her marriage that had led her to orchestrate this plan. Her voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of vulnerability that I hadn't seen before. The revelation shifted the dynamic between us. I realized that beneath her control and apparent confidence was a woman grappling with her own pain. The notion of revenge, if it existed, was intertwined with a desperate hope to heal wounds long ignored. This understanding complicated my feelings toward her, blurring the lines between friend and adversary. Throughout the day, the man appeared and disappeared like a shadow, his presence felt even when absent. When he was near, our interactions were charged yet cautious. He was careful not to overstep boundaries, yet there was a softness in his demeanor that hinted at a deeper struggle. I sensed that he too was caught in the middle of a tangled web, seeking solace while guarding his own heart. We shared moments of quiet conversation, each word weighted with unspoken meaning. The garden became a sanctuary where truths could be hinted at without being fully exposed. I found myself drawn to the simplicity of these interactions, where gestures and glances spoke louder than words. As evening approached, the atmosphere thickened with the unsaid. The house, bathed in fading light, seemed to hold its breath. I felt the tension coil tighter within me, a mix of anticipation and fear. The boundaries of our arrangement felt increasingly fragile, as if any misstep could unravel everything. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, haunted by the complexity of the day. The lines between loyalty and betrayal, friendship and manipulation, passion and pain, blurred into an indistinct haze. I realized that this was no longer just a simple act of reclaiming something lost, it was a confrontation with the parts of myself I had long avoided. The quiet of the countryside contrasted sharply with the storm raging inside me. I knew the path ahead would be fraught with difficult choices and unforeseen consequences. Yet amid the uncertainty, there was a resolve taking shape, a determination to face the tangled emotions head-on, to seek clarity even if it meant risking everything I thought I knew. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable the moment we met again. The air between us was charged, filled with an unspoken tension that both unsettled and beckoned me. The man, her husband, stood across from me, his eyes holding a quiet intensity that seemed to weigh every word before it was spoken. There was a new layer to his presence now, one that hinted at something deeper than the carefully maintained detachment from before. As we exchanged greetings, the moment came quietly, almost imperceptibly. We kissed. We kissed. No elaborate drama, no sweeping declarations, just that brief contact, electric and laden with meaning. It was as if time paused, allowing me a glimpse of the passion I'd long thought lost. The simplicity of that kiss carried with it a flood of emotions, hope, fear, guilt, and desire tangled together in a complex weave. The days that followed were marked by a delicate dance of emotions. I found myself caught between the familiar and the unknown, struggling to reconcile the warmth I felt with the realities I couldn't ignore. The routine of my marriage remained, but beneath the surface, everything had shifted. My husband's distance felt more pronounced, his silences heavier. At home, I was both present and absent, a spectator to a life that no longer felt fully mine. The man's presence lingered in my thoughts, his quiet strength, the way he seemed to understand the unspoken parts of my pain. Our interactions grew in subtle complexity, moments of shared glances and half-words that hinted at possibilities neither of us dared to name. There was a vulnerability there, a recognition that we were both navigating fragile ground. Meanwhile, my friend watched from the sidelines with a steady gaze. Her involvement was a constant reminder of the stakes and the delicate balance we were trying to maintain. Yet beneath her composed exterior, I sensed an emotional undercurrent, a tension between control and uncertainty that mirrored my own. Her role in this unfolding drama was both as instigator and protector, a paradox that I struggled to comprehend. One afternoon, we found ourselves alone in the garden again, the sun casting long shadows across the grass. The quiet between us was filled with an intensity that words could not capture. I noticed how his eyes softened when he looked at me, how the usual barriers seemed to falter in those brief moments. There was an honesty in those exchanges, a shared acknowledgement of the complexities we faced. The garden, with its blooms and fading light, became a place where the boundaries blurred, not just between us, but within myself. I grappled with feelings I hadn't allowed space for in years, longing, uncertainty, the aching need to be seen and understood. It was a fragile space, one where hope and fear coexisted uneasily. At night, my thoughts were restless. The kiss, simple though it was, had opened a door to a world where the rules were no longer clear. I questioned my choices, the path I had embarked upon, and the consequences that inevitably loomed. The quiet of the countryside contrasted with the turmoil inside me, a reminder that peace was often a fragile illusion. As I lay awake, I considered the man's quiet presence in my life and the roles we were all playing. The line between friend and foe, love and betrayal, was thinner than I had imagined. The journey ahead promised no easy answers, only the challenge of confronting the truths we had long avoided. Yet despite the fear and uncertainty, a spark of something new flickered within me, a tentative hope that amidst the complexities, I might find a way back to myself. The city came back into view through the windshield like a memory I wasn't ready to revisit. After the quiet of the countryside, the skyline felt imposing, the streets too fast, the noise too sharp. I sat in the passenger seat, my friend beside me, both of us silently watching the landscape blur past. She had invited me for this weekend trip back under the pretense of errands, but we both knew the real reason. Time away had shifted something in all of us, and now we were returning to a life that no longer fit the same. Our conversation was minimal. She focused on the road, her jaw tight, her thoughts elsewhere. I watched her from the corner of my eye, trying to decipher her mood. I sensed a change in her, a softening, maybe, or a growing uncertainty that matched my own. Whatever control she once had over this story we were all tangled in, it seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Back in the apartment, everything looked just as it had before, furniture in the same place, windows letting in the same light. But it felt different. The silence wasn't restful anymore. It was charged. My husband was due home later that evening, and I knew I wouldn't be able to look him in the eye without feeling the gravity of what I carried inside. Nothing between us had been said aloud, but my heart held a growing reservoir of guilt, and something else, resolve, maybe. The need to face myself without hiding behind routine. That afternoon, I found myself pacing. The phone lay untouched on the table, but my thoughts ran wild with imagined messages. Would he text me? Would she? What did they expect from me now? I didn't have the answers. I only knew that I couldn't pretend to be the same woman who had left a few days earlier. When the knock came at the door, I wasn't surprised. He stood there, calm as ever, with the same guarded expression he always wore. He stepped inside without hesitation, and for a long moment, we simply looked at each other. He asked how I was, and I answered honestly, I didn't know. That seemed to satisfy him more than any polite lie would have. We sat down in the living room, the same place we had first met weeks ago. But the energy between us had changed. There was no performance now. No masks. He spoke about the strangeness of everything, how what had started as a gesture, a favor, had grown into something far more complicated. I listened, and for the first time, I believed his honesty. He didn't try to justify what had happened. He didn't make it romantic or tragic. He acknowledged the mess of it all, the confusion, the unintended consequences. There was a humility in his words that disarmed me. We weren't victims or villains, we were simply people trying to navigate the wreckage of our choices. The conversation meandered into personal territory, his marriage, her expectations, the strain of living under someone else's blueprint. He admitted he had agreed to her plan thinking it would be temporary, something controlled and contained. But it hadn't stayed that way. Somewhere along the line, he had stopped seeing me as a role to play and started seeing me as a person. And I had felt it too. I couldn't deny that anymore. As much as I wanted to keep things clean, to label everything neatly, I had started to feel again. Not for him necessarily, but for myself. I was waking up from years of emotional numbness. That realization terrified me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake for hours, thoughts looping endlessly. I kept going back to a moment from earlier in the week, the way he had looked at me across the garden, how unguarded his eyes had been, how I had felt seen in a way I hadn't for years. Not desired, not pursued. Just seen. The next morning, my friend called. Her voice was different, less composed, softer. She asked how I was feeling, and I answered truthfully again, conflicted. She sighed on the other end of the line, a long exhale that sounded like the release of something she'd been holding in. She told me she understood. That maybe none of us had known what we were doing when we started this. That maybe it had always been about more than just helping me, or spicing up her marriage, or reclaiming something lost. Maybe, she said, it was about testing our own limits. Her words didn't offer comfort. But they gave me something to hold on to. The understanding that I wasn't alone in this confusion. That we had all wandered into something much bigger than we had anticipated. Later that day, I went out for a walk. I needed air, space, silence that wasn't heavy with memory. As I moved through the city streets, I noticed things I hadn't in a long time: the way light filtered between buildings, the rhythm of people moving past each other, all caught in their own small battles. I felt like one of them again. Present. Real. Not hidden behind expectations or guilt. When I returned home, my husband was already back. He was in the kitchen, moving around with practiced indifference. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment, our eyes met. There was no accusation there. No warmth either. Just the weight of all the things we weren't saying. I realized then that this silence between us wasn't passive, it was a decision. And maybe it had been for years. I didn't say anything. I walked past him, not out of defiance but because I didn't know what to say that wouldn't feel hollow. I needed time. And I knew, now more than ever, that time alone wouldn't fix what was broken. It would only make me more aware of what I truly needed. That night, I stood by the window, looking out at the city lights. Behind me, the apartment felt smaller somehow, like the walls had crept closer while I wasn't looking. I thought about the garden again. The quiet. The man. The woman who had been brave, or reckless, enough to offer her husband to a friend. And I thought about myself, standing in the middle of all of it, trying to find my footing. This wasn't over. It hadn't even reached its center yet. But something was shifting inside me, slow and steady. I wasn't the same. And no matter how things ended, I knew I couldn't go back to who I had been. That woman was already fading, and in her place, someone else was beginning to emerge, uncertain, imperfect, but alive. The hours that led to that night blurred into one long stretch of silence, filled with small, meaningless movements and quiet glances I couldn't interpret. I didn't make plans. I didn't even know who called who, or whether it was arranged by her again. All I remember is standing in front of the mirror, brushing my hair with slow, steady strokes, not because I cared how I looked, but because I needed something to do with my hands. The air felt heavy that evening. Not with dread, exactly, but with the unmistakable sense that a line was about to be crossed, a line that had been slowly dissolving for weeks now. I left my phone on silent. I didn't want distractions, questions, or last-minute decisions. I walked the few blocks with my coat pulled tight, the city around me alive in a way I was not. I didn't feel excitement or fear, only a strange, quiet acceptance. Like the moment had already happened and I was just catching up to it. The place we met was unfamiliar, not her house, not mine. It was neutral, like the space between two truths. The door opened before I could knock, and there he was, expression unreadable but not cold. He stepped back to let me in, and I crossed the threshold without speaking. We didn't talk much. There was no need for words. The silence between us had learned to carry its own weight. We spent the night together. In the quiet of that room, without the eyes of others, without roles to perform, I felt something uncoil inside me. Not freedom. Not even joy. Just the absence of suppression. I wasn't trying to be anyone. I wasn't trying to belong to anything. I was simply present, in my skin, in my decisions, in my conflict. When I woke up hours later, it was still dark. He was asleep beside me, steady breath rising and falling. I stared at the ceiling, counting shadows, counting my thoughts. I didn't feel guilt in the traditional sense. It wasn't a betrayal of love, it was a betrayal of patterns, of silence, of a life built on the avoidance of truth. And still, the ache in my chest wasn't relief. It was mourning. Mourning the version of me that used to believe her life was whole, even when it was only intact on the surface. I got dressed quietly, not wanting to wake him. There was no dramatic goodbye, no whispered promises or lingering hands. We had both known from the beginning what this was and what it wasn't. I left the apartment and stepped back into the city, the air cool against my face, the noise slowly rising like a distant tide. I walked aimlessly for a while, through streets that felt more vivid than I remembered. It was like every sound, every flickering light, was sharper, more insistent. As if the world could sense the fracture inside me. I kept my head down, trying not to let the weight of what had just happened drag me into shame. I knew I would have to face it soon, the consequences, the unraveling. But for those few minutes, I let myself just walk. One step after another. When I returned home, the apartment was still. My husband hadn't noticed my absence, or if he had, he didn't mention it. He was in the living room with the TV on, his eyes glazed in that tired, distant way that had become so familiar. I stood in the doorway for a few seconds, watching him. There was a time when I would have felt something sharp at that sight, disappointment, resentment, longing. But now I just felt distant. As if we lived parallel lives that never intersected anymore. He looked over at me, nodded, then turned back to the screen. That was it. That was our conversation. That was our marriage. No confrontation, no demand for truth, just a mutual agreement to keep living beside each other rather than with each other. And in a strange way, it made things easier. The permission to keep pretending had already been granted long ago. I went to the bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. I didn't cry. I didn't move. I just let the quiet settle around me like a fog. I knew something had shifted in me permanently. Not because of the night itself, but because of what it had represented. It was the first time in years I had stepped outside the role assigned to me, the wife, the caretaker, the steady one. I had been someone else, even if only for a few hours. And I couldn't go back to pretending I hadn't felt it. Later that morning, she called. Her voice was calm, careful. She asked if I was okay, and I said yes. It was a lie, but not a cruel one. She asked no further questions. I could tell she already knew. There was no triumph in her tone, no satisfaction. If anything, it sounded like she was tired. Maybe even regretful. For a brief second, I wondered if she had orchestrated all of this not to hurt me, but to see if she could break something in herself too. I didn't ask. We spoke for only a few minutes before ending the call. It was the first time since this all began that I felt she and I were no longer on the same side of anything. We were just two women drifting in different directions, each carrying her own damage, her own choices. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes had been washed and put away. I stared at the steam rising from my tea and thought about what it meant to live a life that was no longer built on habit. The version of me that had walked through that door the night before no longer existed. And the version sitting here now didn't have a clear path forward. But she was awake. She was paying attention. And maybe, for the first time in years, that was enough. The city moved around me, unchanged, unaware. But everything inside me had shifted. I woke the next morning not to the sound of an alarm or the familiar shuffle of my husband's routine, but to a hollow stillness that seemed to echo through every wall. The silence no longer felt neutral, it felt like absence. Like the space after something essential had broken. I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, fully dressed, but unable to rise. The weight of what had happened, of what I had allowed to happen, sat on my chest like a second heartbeat. He hadn't asked me anything. Not where I had been. Not who I'd been with. My husband moved through the apartment like a man accustomed to shadows, content not to turn on the light. He had stopped asking questions a long time ago, and now I understood why that silence had always made me feel both safe and invisible. It had given me freedom and taken something precious from me in return, my reflection. Later that day, I found myself wandering the old market near our building. I didn't need anything, not food, not clothes. I just needed to be among people. I watched strangers touch fruit, argue over prices, complain about the weather. I listened to their voices, not the words, just the tones. There was something grounding in their ordinariness. I wasn't looking for distraction. I was looking for proof that the world still turned. When I returned, I found an envelope slipped under our door. No name. No handwriting. Inside was a single photograph. Me, at the garden, back at her house. A side angle, slightly out of focus, but unmistakably me. My face was half turned. I wasn't doing anything incriminating, just standing. But the timing, it was recent. I felt a chill in my spine that had nothing to do with cold. Someone had been watching. I turned the photo over. Nothing. No message. No threat. Just the image. But that was enough. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't expected. Vulnerable not because of what I'd done, but because someone else knew. Someone else had been close. Close enough to see but not close enough to stop me. I sat with the photo for a while, my fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't fear exactly, it was the realization that the world I had been navigating wasn't just emotional or internal. Someone else had stepped into it. I immediately thought of her. My friend. The woman who had given me permission. The woman who had offered her husband like a puzzle piece she no longer needed. I called her. She didn't pick up. I tried again. No answer. I sat down at the kitchen table and tried to put the pieces together. Had this been her way of reminding me of the deal we'd made? Had she orchestrated everything, even this? Or had things gone too far even for her? I couldn't know. And that not knowing gnawed at me worse than any guilt I'd felt since this all began. That night, my husband and I sat in the same room for nearly an hour without speaking. I watched him from across the living room, the flickering light of the television playing across his face. He was fading too, in his own way. Not from age, but from disconnection. We had become two people who shared a space and almost nothing else. I thought about telling him. Not the details, not the night, but the truth of what I had been feeling. The truth of what had been missing between us. But I couldn't. The words didn't come. Not out of cowardice, but because I didn't know if there was anything left that could be fixed with language. The following day, she called. Her voice was quiet, tired. You got it, didn't you? I said nothing. I needed you to see it. I needed you to understand that this wasn't just about you finding yourself. It was about me watching it happen. That was the deal. Still, I said nothing. I wasn't trying to hurt you, she continued. But I wanted you to feel what I felt. A long time ago, you crossed a line with someone I loved. And I never said anything. I just waited. Until now. My throat tightened. I forgave you back then. Or at least I tried. But some things don't go away just because we stop talking about them. I finally spoke. My voice was low and unsteady. Why now? Because I wanted to see if you'd do it. If you'd make the same choice again. And you did. I don't remember hanging up. I don't remember moving to the window or sitting down on the floor. I just remember the weight of her words settling over me like dust. The past I thought I'd buried had returned, not in anger, but in design. This had never been about helping me rediscover something. It had been about her watching me lose it all. The irony was unbearable. I had thought I was reclaiming my sense of self, my desire, my womanhood. And maybe I had. But I had done it under the gaze of someone who never truly forgave me. Someone who had built a stage for me to collapse on. I closed my eyes and let the silence swell around me again. But this time, I didn't feel numb. I felt awake. She had orchestrated the fall, yes, but the steps I took were mine. I had chosen every one of them. And now I had to choose what came next. Not for her. Not even for him. But for myself. The photo still sat on the counter. I picked it up again, held it between two fingers, and for the first time, I didn't flinch. It was just an image. A moment. A piece of something larger. It didn't define me. Not anymore. Whatever came next, I knew one thing with certainty: I would no longer be part of someone else's narrative. I would no longer live in someone else's silence or revenge. I would find my own truth. Even if it meant losing everything along the way. The days that followed felt hollow in a way I hadn't expected. Not dramatic. Not tragic. Just deeply, irrevocably altered. I went through the motions, waking, dressing, cooking, speaking when spoken to, but everything inside me was suspended in a kind of quiet reckoning. I wasn't unraveling. I wasn't even breaking. I was simply pausing, hovering in that space between one life and another. Between who I had been and who I might still become. I didn't return her calls after that. She left 3 voicemails, each one quieter than the last, her voice moving from confident to confused to finally defeated. There was no apology in any of them, only a restless circling around the truth we both now shared. She had orchestrated something cruel, yes. But I had walked into it willingly. She wanted me to know she hadn't meant for it to go so far. But that was the problem, none of us knew what too far really meant until we were already beyond it. I couldn't bring myself to respond. Not yet. Maybe not ever. My husband, for his part, remained consistent in his silence. There was no confrontation, no sudden burst of emotion, no late-night conversation asking where I had been or what I had done. We drifted past each other like 2 boats in the same harbor, tethered by routine and memory, but pointed in opposite directions. Every now and then, I would catch him watching me for brief, flickering moments, but his gaze always dropped before I could read what was behind it. I thought about telling him everything. Not out of guilt or a need for forgiveness, but because honesty had started to feel like the only form of control I still had. But I also knew that it wouldn't change anything. The gap between us wasn't formed by a single act, it had been dug over years of neglect, of avoidance, of unspoken pain. And so, I waited. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, while folding laundry, that I made a decision. I wasn't going to run. Not from her. Not from him. And not from myself. I needed to see this through, to close the loop, whatever that meant. I didn't want revenge, or clarity, or even an apology. I just wanted to stand in front of her one last time and not flinch. I sent her a message, tomorrow. The cafe by the square. 11 a.m. She replied within minutes, I'll be there. The next morning felt strangely calm. I took my time getting ready, not because I wanted to impress her, but because I needed to feel solid in my own skin. I wore simple clothes. No makeup. Just me, as I was, unvarnished, unmasked, and no longer interested in playing a role. The cafe was nearly empty when I arrived. She was already there, sitting by the window, a half-empty cup of tea in front of her. She looked up when I entered, her face neutral but her eyes shadowed with something I couldn't place, regret, maybe, or weariness. I sat down across from her without a word. For a moment, we just stared at each other. 2 women with too much history, too many buried truths between them. And then, softly, she spoke. I didn't know it would go like this, she said. I thought it would be different. Cleaner. Easier. I didn't respond. I waited. She looked down at her hands, folded tightly in her lap. I told myself I was helping you. That you needed to feel something again. But that wasn't the whole truth. I nodded slightly. You were angry. She looked up, surprised I'd said it so plainly. Yes, she whispered. I was. There it was. The core of everything. Not lust. Not betrayal. But anger. A wound that had never healed. A debt she had decided, quietly and over time, that I still owed. She sighed. I waited years to say something. And by the time I was ready, I didn't know how to say it without turning it into something else. So I did what I did. And I watched. I watched you fall into the same mistake I made. Maybe that makes me cruel. Maybe it makes you human, I said quietly. We sat with that for a while. Letting the honesty settle between us like dust. Finally, she asked, do you hate me? I thought about it. Truly. Carefully. No, I said. But I don't know if I can forgive you. Not yet. She nodded, as if that answer was more generous than she deserved. I stood. She didn't try to stop me. She didn't reach for my hand or offer another apology. She just looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in a long while. And I saw her not as the architect of my pain, but as someone who had been drowning in her own. I left the cafe and didn't look back. Walking home, the city felt different again. Less sharp. Less hostile. Like it had accepted my return. At home, my husband wasn't there. A note on the counter said he had gone to visit his brother. No time of return. No affection. Just information. I poured myself a glass of water and stared out the kitchen window. The plants on the windowsill were dying. I hadn't noticed before. I touched one of the brittle leaves with my fingertip and felt a strange kind of sadness rise in me. Not because they were dying. But because I'd let them. That night, I didn't wait up. I didn't pretend to read or watch television. I simply lay in bed, eyes open, listening to the sound of the apartment breathing around me. The walls, the floors, the pipes. Everything speaking in soft, mechanical whispers. I thought about what I would say to him if he ever asked. I imagined 100 versions of that conversation. Some loud. Some tearful. Some numb. But the version I kept returning to was the one where I simply told the truth. I'm not who I was. And I don't think I want to be again. That was the only truth I knew how to carry now. The rest, what would stay, what would fall apart, would come in time. The morning after our meeting at the cafe, I woke before the sun rose. The city outside was still draped in that thin, pre-dawn hush, where even the streetlights seemed to hesitate. I sat up slowly, my body heavy, but my mind strangely clear. I had expected to feel something definitive by now, relief, rage, release, but what I felt instead was an unfamiliar kind of steadiness. A quiet resolve that came not from answers, but from finally stopping the search for them. The apartment felt different. Not because anything had changed within it, but because I was no longer pretending it was something it wasn't. This wasn't a sanctuary. It wasn't a partnership. It was a place where two people had once built something and then quietly let it erode, piece by piece, until all that remained was habit. He came home later that morning. I heard the door click open, the familiar sound of keys tossed into the dish by the entryway. I didn't go out to greet him. I stayed seated at the kitchen table, a lukewarm mug of tea in front of me, the air around me filled with everything we had stopped saying years ago. When he finally appeared in the doorway, he looked tired. Not in a dramatic way, but in the way people look when they've been carrying too much for too long. He looked at me, and for the first time in weeks, our eyes held. There was no confrontation, no accusation, just the faintest flicker of recognition. As if he saw me again, not the woman he had married, not the version of me he had quietly accepted, but the person sitting in front of him now. Different. Changed. We spoke very little. A few words exchanged about his trip, a few nods in place of conversation. But the silence between us felt new. It wasn't the familiar, oppressive kind. It was open-ended. Spacious. The kind of silence where something might be built again, if either of us had the courage. Later that day, I went through the drawers in our bedroom and pulled out things I hadn't touched in years. Old journals. Cards. Photographs from better times, and some from worse. I didn't cry. I didn't linger over them. I simply acknowledged them. Each piece a chapter of a life that had led me here. I packed a small bag, not because I was leaving forever, but because I needed space. Space to think. To breathe. To ask myself the questions I'd avoided for too long. I left him a note. Simple. Honest. I need time. Not to run. Not to punish you. But to understand who I am now, and whether that person can live in this life we've created. I'm not angry. I'm not asking anything from you right now. Just time. I didn't wait for his reaction. I left quietly, closing the door behind me with a soft click. The hallway outside felt like a threshold. And as I walked toward the elevator, bag in hand, I felt no fear. Only clarity. I checked into a small guest house near the park. Nothing fancy. Just a clean room with a window that overlooked trees instead of rooftops. I spent the first afternoon doing nothing. No phone. No email. No music. Just silence. Just me. And for the first time in years, I let myself feel all of it. The grief. The relief. The questions without answers. That night, I stood by the window and watched people pass below, couples, kids on scooters, a man walking a dog. Their lives continued, ordinary and unknowing. And I wasn't envious. I didn't wish to be them. I just wanted to be real. No more pretending. No more avoiding. Just one woman owning her mistakes and trying to understand what they meant. I thought about her, my friend. I thought about the night we had dinner years ago, the one where everything had changed and we didn't even know it. How easy it had been to cross a line and never realize until it was too late. I had betrayed her then, and she had betrayed me now. But somehow, we had both survived it. Not intact. Not clean. But surviving still. And I thought about him, her husband. And mine. The men we had folded into these stories like props, expecting them to carry our unspoken burdens without understanding what they meant. I didn't know if I loved my husband anymore. I didn't even know if I truly had in the last few years. But I did know that I didn't hate him. And maybe that was a place to start. The next morning, I wrote. Not for anyone else. Not for explanation. Just for myself. I wrote down everything, what I remembered, what I regretted, what I didn't. I wrote the parts one was ashamed of and the parts one couldn't justify. I let the pages take all of it so I didn't have to carry it alone anymore. I didn't know what would come next. If I would return home in a week, or a month, or never. I didn't know if my marriage could be rebuilt or if it had already quietly crumbled beyond repair. I didn't know if forgiveness, hers, his, mine, was possible or even necessary. But for the first time, the not knowing didn't paralyze me. Because I had finally told myself the truth. I had stopped waiting for someone else to give me permission to feel, to act, to change. I had stepped into the center of my own life again, messy and uncertain though it was. And from that place, I would make my choices. Not as someone's wife. Not as someone's mistake. But as me. That was the end of one story. And the beginning of whatever came next.